Hey guys, we welcome you back on board to the CyberPod. Today, we are here with a brand new episode for you guys, the first episode of the year 2022. And we have brought a very interesting topic for you guys so that you can expand the knowledge of cybersecurity. My name is Sahan Senevirathne.
And I'm Triashi Silva, and we will be hosting today. Jahan, today we have a very interesting topic, which is ISO 27001 and its importance. So Jahan, do you have any idea about what is ISO?
I do have a very small understanding about ISO, Triashi. So what ISO stands for is International Organization for Standardizations. And what it does is it brings together experts to share knowledge and to develop market-relevant international standards so that it will provide solutions for global challenges. And also, Triashi, this was established in the year 1926.
So it's pretty much a very old standardization.
Yes.
And Jahan, if we talk about the main aims of this ISO 27000 series and ISO standardization, to promote the quality of the products and also to improve the quality of life, safety, health, and protection of environment, and as well as to improve the industrial efficiency and international trade by avoiding and removing the barriers and which are mainly caused by the differences in national practices are some of the main aims. And do you have any idea about the main four industries that ISO is utilized in?
Yes, Triashi. So it's technology, food safety, agriculture, and healthcare. And also, we know that ISO has many standards. And mainly for information security, the standardization that we use is the ISO 27000 family. So, do you know the importance of this ISO 27000?
So, some of the main importances are Jahan, quality management, information management, and risk management. So, these are some of the main importances in ISO 27001. And also when we look into our topic today, which is ISO 27001 certification and its importance, which is used to manage information security. And to talk about this topic, guys, we have brought you guys a guest and to talk about this in depth.
So we'll introduce the expert to you. So Triashi, would you like to introduce him to our viewers?
Yes, Jahan. Jahan, today our guest is Sahan Senevirathne. He is the Chief Information Security Officer and currently works in MOQ Digital Company.
So Triashi, he's a specialist in IT security, auditing, and security and network operation centers, and also in incident management. Simply a specialist in the cybersecurity field. Mr. Sahan, we welcome you on board to the CyberPod. Mr. Sahan, once again, thank you for joining with us in our podcast series and taking time off of the schedule and coming here today. So we have a few questions for you. So let's start with the first question.
Firstly, Mr. Sahan, what is the ISO 27000 certification and why do you think it is important?
So first of all, thank you guys for having me. And then when it comes to ISO certification, before I go into that, I'd like to talk about security compliance and certifications, right? Because those are three things that people sometimes mix up or interchange. When it comes to security, it's actually a clear set of technical tools or systems that you use to make sure that your enterprise or organization or business is secure. So that's just technical controls or security controls that you put in place, right? When it comes to even other controls, just not just technical, but when it comes to compliance, that means that you're following some sort of standard, ISO or NIST or whatever, and you're complying to that standard, right? And then when it comes to certification, that means a third party or an authorized third party has certified that you are following that particular certification or compliance level, right? So that's where the difference is. And this is something that people need to understand. And when it comes to ISO 27001, it's actually used for ISMS, so Information Systems Management, right? So it's basically for IT systems companies or managed service providers or anyone who's having managed IT systems. They can follow ISO 27001 to make sure that they uplift their standard of security and that they maintain a good level of security throughout their organization. And why is it important? It's actually good to know that you're secure, and also like we become complacent, right? Let's say if you have an organization, you implement security there. After some time, you might lapse on maybe reviewing something, or you might not do your proper patching or things like that. So when you are certified or when you have a certification, you have to go on periodic auditing, and then a third party, a authorized third party or a accepted third party does that evaluation. So that way you are guaranteed that you are secure, and the most important thing is that you can show the world that you are secure. So this will be a good marketing tool for you as well, because and also there are clients who might require their vendors to be ISO certified or maintain a certain level of compliance. So having that certification will give you an edge in terms of marketing and winning new businesses as well. So and the other thing is regulatory compliance, right? Because more and more governments, more and more countries are now looking at making sure that their infrastructure or their companies or whatever data that is in their country is secure. So having ISO compliance helps in making sure that you comply with those standards as well, because it shows that you've done your due diligence, you've gone through the whole set of cycles around it, and then making sure that your company is secure. So for all those stakeholders, it shows that you are maintaining that level of high standard. And when it comes to ISO, it's a well-renowned body. So ISO 27001 has been around for some time as well, and is quite recognized. So that's why it is important to have that certification.
So, Mr. Sahan, how does the implementation and renewal process is done? And also, could you talk about the parties that are involved and their contribution in the life cycle?
Okay. So when it comes to getting into ISO, right, or any sort of certification, something that people try to do is they try to think about the whole organization, right? Now let's say you have like 5 departments and you have 1,000 employees and things like that. Some people think that you need to implement it to the whole organization, right? And also another thing that people think is, like, let's say you're a startup, there's a cost involved in the certification because you have to do audits, you have to take resource persons to do this, and then maybe you need to train your people. So there's a cost that is involved as well. So a lot of people think that it's a massive engagement, but something that people forget is ISO certifications can be obtained just for departments or segmented parts of your company. And the other thing is, before you come to the certification, you can start with just simply compliance. So in my experience, as well as what I've seen in the industry, the easiest way for you to start is by complying first. So let's say you have an internal IT department, maybe you start there. You start by aligning your processes or policies that you have for that department to comply with ISO 27001, right? And this can be depending on the size of the organization, depending on your business requirement. I mean, if you are planning to win a business in the next 6 months that wants ISO certification, that's a different story. But let's say you want to do it in a long run, what I'd suggest is first start small, right? Implement it to part of your organization, and maybe you don't have to implement all the controls either. You can just start by your main systems and then cascade it to the rest of the systems and the company and the departments. For example, one of the companies that I've worked in, right, only the internal IT and one of their sites was compliant. For example, Colombo was compliant, but not the rest of the sites. But later on, they brought in another site, and then later on they brought in another department. So things like that can be done, because when it comes to, I'll talk about the renewals a little later, but when it comes to the implementation side of things, first start small, and start with a segmented part, a small area of the business, and then you can look at compliance. And when it comes to the implementation or the process of doing this, you first need to have the buy-in of the the board or the management, senior management, or the topmost stakeholders. Without that, you won't be able to implement. So once you have that, you find a third party, an auditing firm, or like even the big four firms actually do this, who would come and consult you, because you might not have the resources, or you can actually hire somebody or even an individual or private consultant. Depending on your budget, you can move into any of those areas. And then once you have that consultant, you start small and you develop the system. And I'd say at least have 3 to 6 months of preparation before you go in for a certification, at least, because that will give you enough time, because you have to document processes, you have to make sure that all those issues in your systems are fixed and things like that, and then go for the formal audit and the certification. And when it comes to renewals, usually that happens in 3-year cycles. So every year you are audited, but it's actually on the 3rd year that your certificate is issued. And the good thing is, let's say they do find any issues while you're renewing, there'll be a period. I mean, they'll give you just to do the corrections that you have to do, and then reapply. Because sometimes they might even hold your certification, and during that time you can't say that you're ISO compliant, but they won't take the certificate off or decline the certificate. They'll hold it until you comply. They'll give a grace period if you can provide a solid plan, because that has also happened in an organization that I've worked for. Because and I think we can talk about that later on the discussion, because sometimes when you implement processes after a period of time, because employees change, business change, you have growing requirements, people try to take the easy path, things like that happen, and you deviate from the process. So sometimes you do get minor or major non-compliances, which will cause for a hold of the certificate. And anyway, every time you have an audit, there's bound to be issues that are found, or non-compliances that are found, right? So it's always good to have an internal audit cycle as well. I mean, it's part of the requirement as well. So if you have internal audit cycles, good internal audits, that will actually help you with either implementation or even renewal. Because when it comes to the renewal, you've already done your part. You found out the mistakes and fixed them. So those are a few things that need to be in mind. I mean, you need to keep in mind if you are implementing or renewing ISO.
And Mr. Sahan, what are the challenges faced by the company when complying the ISO 27000 certification?
Cool. So when before going to that, I think I'll touch base on the whole cycle as well, right? I think I missed that part there before. So when it comes to the life cycle of ISO, right? You guys might have heard about the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act, right? That's the most basic thing that we talk about when we talk about continual service improvement as well. So it always goes on a upward slope, right? So it has to, every time the cycle runs, you have to improve. So when it comes to planning, right, you'll have to first have the clear objectives defined on what you want to do in ISO, and then the scope, like I said, where it goes. And then there's a whole bunch of things about risk assessments, asset inventories, and then also documentation involved in that, and then validating the proper controls that you need at what levels. And then when you go to implementation, that's where the do part comes. You implement, and then you make sure that you have management processes and things like that to run the whole system. And then when it comes to checks, that's where the auditing comes, right? And the monitoring, if you have a monitoring system, or if you have an alerting system for your dashboards that you monitor, that's where that comes. And then act is where you continually improve on this. You do the reevaluations and things like that, and then you again plan, and then you go on that whole cycle again. Yeah. And then when it comes to the challenges faced when complying, because it's within this cycle that all these challenges come. So for example, when it comes to risk assessment, when it comes to the planning stage, something a lot of organizations do wrong is they sometimes either give too much of priority or low priority to the risks. So it's very important that you assess the risks accurately and you have a proper metrics, right? The granular that you can go, it's better, but sometimes you shouldn't go for the 100%, right? Because you can never implement something 100%. If you guys have heard about the Pareto analysis, the 80-20 rule, yeah. So where 80% of your problems arise from 20% of the causes. So like any part of the business, if you're implementing ISO or any certification, you need to target that 20% first and then go to the rest. So those 20% of high risks, that's where your main focus should be, and you need to identify and evaluate them properly, and then decide how you want to mitigate them. And the thing is, I mean, of course, when it comes to compliance, the main compliance levels you need to have, but within the parameters, you can define what sort of compliance you go to, because there might be a residual risk that you can actually keep because the business accepts that risk, right? Right. For example, let's say the whole power situation right now that we have in the country. If we lose total power for weeks, there's no point in us trying to do anything, right? Because we can't really switch a business. Let's say you have 100 employees or 1,000 employees. You can't switch all of them to renewable power just like that. I mean, if you have a sustainable building with solar panels to generate enough power, yes, but I don't think any of the companies here have done that. So in such a situation, if that happens, there's nothing that you can do. I mean, if you have an organization, I mean, a branch in another country with enough capacity, maybe you can shift the workloads. But is that sustainable? So there's a level that you accept as well, right? So I'm just talking about the business continuity side of things. But even when, let's say, even if it comes to perimeter security, you might just have a firewall and some access control, access list and things like that, and you can have the minimum required. But whether you want to have an IDS or an IPS behind that, whether you want to have a demilitarized zone, that's actually dependent on what your requirement is, right? So you need to identify, because, for example, if you have publicly available information on a website, you don't have to make that whole thing very secure. I mean, of course, you prevent people from accessing and defacing it, but you don't have to like have a whole bunch of controls because there's no IP in that or anything that needs or personally identifiable information that needs to be protected. So you need to evaluate the risk properly, and then the ownership of the project. So usually what companies do is they hire either a project manager or a third party, or they hire a CISO or a security manager or somebody, some role, and then they give that person the project and they need to run it. But the thing is, people need to take ownership, especially the executive leadership. It should be a top-down approach, because whenever you say audits, everyone's either scared or they don't like it, right? Auditors are usually people who are disliked, because I've done a bit of internal auditing myself, and it's always good to have a rapport with the people, because if not, they will not actually come out with what they're actually doing or the real situation. So you should have a top-down approach where the management says, look here, this is what we need to do, and this is the reason for doing it, and this is why all of you should help. For example, the company that I told that the certification was held for 3 months, I was there in the discussion where the CEO actually said, look, we shouldn't be sweeping these things under the rug, so show the auditor the faults and then let's fix it afterwards. So that sort of buy-in needs to be there from the leadership, and since that was there, we were able to rectify the issue and then get the certification as well. Let's say you hide things and you get the certification. In the long run, if you get compromised, it's a bigger reputational risk that you can't actually sometimes even recover from. So that's something that we need to remember. And then lack of project planning. So like I said, trying to eat the whole cake at once. You need to eat it piece by piece and then plan it within a 6 months or 3 months period, or even longer if you require it. But I believe 3 to 6 months is more than enough if you really want to get it done. And then also stakeholder investment. Like if you have different teams, now for example, an MSP like us, we have different departments like the Network Operations Center, the Security Operations Center, a team for backups, team for system assurance that look after patching and things like that. So you need to get the involvement of all those stakeholders. You can't just have one party doing it well and the other party not, right? So you need to get that buy-in. And then you also need to have a proper gap analysis done and the communication done. So what will be ideal is to get your, if you have an internal audit team, great. If not, you can get a third party that does auditing, and then you do a proper gap analysis done, and then you communicate that these are the issues, and then you fix it, right? And that's something that you can do. And then also the communication around what you do to everyone. So from the CEO to the person at the least end of it, even let's say even security guard at the door needs to know that they shouldn't let in people who are unauthorized into the office, because that can be part of the compliance. Because if they go into the office and if the server room is not locked and they go into the server room, that's a breach of compliance, right? So everybody from in that organization needs to know and be in line with whatever you are doing, and how, depending on what it means to their role in that organization. So those are a few challenges that companies face when it comes to complying with the standard.
So, Mr. Sahan, what are the challenges faced by companies when upgrading to a new version?
So even when you're upgrading, most of the challenges still remain the same. And I think a few clear ones, what I mentioned before, deviation from the processes, because that happens over time. So depending on, even if it's an upgrade or a normal renewal, that is something that always comes if you don't have checks and balances, right? So another thing is not understanding the gap from what the current standard that you're following and any amendments or corrections that have happened, right? So for example, the version that we follow right now, ISO 27001 2013, that had additions coming into it in 2014, and then there was another that was a little later, and then also in 2015. So 2014 and 15 were the main ones, and then there was one amendment done in between. So they do add and tweak things where they think there was a mistake or there needs to be improvements. So usually you don't miss it, because the external auditing body that gives you the certification, they cover that. So they'll tell you about it. The only thing is, if you have someone third party auditing you, they also would help you with it. But if you're having any internal resources, you need to make sure that they are in line with this. They go to the ISO, maybe the main page, or because sometimes you have to pay for this information. So you can, and also if you YouTube it or Google it, you can find it for free as well, because a lot of people talk about these things. So you need to always be on top of it, identify that gap, and then fill it, right? That's something that you need to do. And also when it comes to the renewals, something that happens is, let's say, I mean, with turnover, sometimes in an IT company, it's 2 to 3 years maximum staff change, right? So if someone doesn't know that something has actually, if someone new comes in, they might not know the usual processes, what has happened, or the history about ISO. And even people who are in the organization might forget. So proper documentation of what has happened will also help, up-to-date documentation. So for an upgrade or any renewal, you need to keep those documents relevant. I'd suggest at least an annual review of your policies and documents needs to happen, so that that you are able to easily transition or upgrade. And even when it comes to the tools, let's say you have an EDR, or let's say a normal antivirus that is managed, or you have a ISMS or a ticketing tool or a compliance tool that you have, at least quarterly do the reviews of those tools, because then you'll know where it is, and then once you know where you want to go, you can analyze that gap and then do that jump very easily. So that's something that you need to think about, and those are like the main challenges that you have.
Finally, Mr. Sahan, do you have any comments to add to this conversation?
Yeah, so when it comes to security, people, I mean, something that's commonly known in Sri Lanka is ISO 27001, but something that people need to remember is that can be a baseline, because that's well established. A lot of people know about it, and when you bring in resources, they might already know about it. They've worked in environments like that, so that can be a good stepping stone. But you need to remember that when it comes to your business, you need to also think about the where you are going to the market. I mean, whether it's within Sri Lanka or whether it's in Australia, whether it's in US. So if it's Australia, just because you have ISO doesn't mean that everything is covered. You might even have to look at Essential 8, which is sort of like a compliance level that Australian government wants companies to maintain. And let's say you're going to Australia, then because I'm working for an Australian MSP, right? So clients would come to you and ask you for maybe a minimum level of level 2 in Essential 8. So you need to know what those are, and then, like I said, you can get ISO by having the minimum requirement, but that might not be what is needed in the industry for your business. Let's say you're going for a medical or pharmaceutical business targeting for that in US. You need to be compliant with HIPAA, right? So you need to think about all that, but a good baseline to start is ISO. And even when it comes to security, and I even saw in your channel that you guys have looked at cloud computing and things like that, right? So cloud security is something very, very important, right? Especially moving into COVID, and then a lot of organizations trying to move into working from home and using cloud services because it's cheaper and more efficient, right? So in ISO, they even have a specific standard for cloud security, ISO 27017. So if you are in the industry, you shouldn't only know about just ISO 27001. You need to look at the other sides as well. And then data privacy, because data privacy is something that is talked about quite a lot. I mean, even Sri Lanka, they gazetted an act for that. And then, although it's not very popular, it'll be, because that'll have to be considered, right? So ISO has ISO 27018, which is a data privacy standard. So depending on what level of security you want, you can go beyond ISO 27001 as well. And that might open up a different market for you, people who are more into compliance, I mean, you can even target the defense sector or government sector organizations, especially in other countries that might want you to have more certifications. So there are a lot that you can do within the certification and outside the certification. So my suggestion would be to explore, and for upcoming graduates to have an idea about these things, because then when you come into the industry, you'll come with an advantage and more value to whatever the company that you go into. So yeah, that's, I think, my final message.
Mr. Sahan, I think within this short period of time, we have received a lot of information, us as well as our viewers. And on behalf of the cybersecurity community of SLIIT, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude and our heartfelt thank you for joining us with this podcast session, and hope to see you in a future episode as well. Thank you very much once again.
Sure thing, Jahan and Triyasha. Thank you, Triyashi. So thank you for having me.
So guys, we hope that you have gotten vast knowledge about this ISO 27001 certification, isn't it, Triyashi?
Yes, Jahan, I learned a lot about the ISO certification, about the importance and everything regarding the ISO 27001. So, as well as guys, stay tuned for more podcasts. Make sure to like, share and subscribe our YouTube channel. And Jahan?
Also guys, most importantly, stay safe and stay home. We are the cybersecurity community of SLIIT.